Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me today. So I'm excited to share with you a series of projects that we've conducted over the past several years, trying to really understand the patterns and some potential mitigation measures for snake entanglement in erosion control blankets. And really, to give some context, you know, uh, so in terms of where erosion control blankets are being utilized, a big part of it are being utilized by the Texas Department of Transportation, or TxDOT. And so TxDOT, after a construction project, if the soil has been disturbed, um, their erosion control products are mandated to be deployed on the landscape at the conclusion of a project. And when we did this study, we were using products that were on the approved product list from 2018. And at that time, there were 141 approved erosion control products that varied in all sorts of different kind of categories. So there are the kind of these erosion control blankets with these thin kind of plastic netting here, to other things like hydromulch that are kind of these spray-on applications. And to get on that approved product list for TxDOT, the product is evaluated on two criteria. So how well that erosion control product prevents sediment loss, and how well does that product promote plant growth. Okay. But the risk to wildlife is not, at least at this time, a factor to be considered to be put on the approved product list. And so, but this is a concern because, there's been these reports of wildlife entanglement in erosion control blankets. And there, if you look at the literature and various notes, there's reports of reptiles and in particular snakes becoming entangled in erosion control blankets. And, it's a pretty brutal death if you think about it. So, when they become entangled, um, no one's often monitoring these erosion control blankets, so they often die as a result. They're attacked by fire ants. They'll begin to kind of twist around in this plastic mesh and result in deep lacerations. They're exposed to heat. Here in East Texas, it's really hot, and across all of Texas, really. Or they'll die due to starvation or dehydration. And so, um, what we wanted to do first is just kind of conduct a literature review to synthesize these reports. So these reports of snakes becoming entangled in erosion control blankets are scattered in kind of single observations of a species or an individual across the literature. So first we wanted to just conduct a literature review to see, okay, what mesh products may be posing a risk to wildlife, and in particular snakes. And so we have our different mesh kind of categories here on the x-axis. So soil stabilization, wildlife exclusion. So that's kind of like your netting for gardens to keep birds or other things from eating your tomatoes. Fencing, packaging, or not reported. And then this is just the percentage of reporting entanglements. And so from our literature review, we found 156 snakes becoming entangled in these mesh products. The majority were entangled in this wildlife exclusion kind of garden netting product. But the second most one was soil stabilization or erosion control blankets. And and really, we think that this erosion control blanket is entanglements are really underreported, because once they're installed on the landscape, no one's going out and checking those and monitoring them to see if anything's become entangled, once they're out there. And they often cover really large areas. Whereas, this garden netting, this wildlife exclusion netting, they're often deployed on smaller scales, right in someone's backyard, where they're going to note or observe or be able to document an animal becoming entangled more easily. So we really think this erosion control blanket entanglement is underreported. And what we wanted to do is just, okay, in the field, after these erosion control blankets have been installed, what are we seeing out in the field? So we conducted a series of field surveys in Houston County, Texas, and these were TxDOT sites that were recently completed and erosion control blankets were installed. And I want you to make note of the total coverage in terms of the area for the erosion control blankets. It's not a very big area, right? It's a little over 2,000 meters squared across these 9 recently completed construction projects. And so what we did is we conducted 20 surveys over a 43-day period during the summer. And just within that short period and kind of small area, we found 10 entangled snakes, 8 of which were dead and 2 were released. And 2 of the dead snakes were gravid females. And they were species of the western rat snake, coach whip, the North American racer, and then plain-bellied water snake. And so, you know, this field survey was conducted over a fairly short period, not very intensive in terms of effort, and really covered a small area in terms of total coverage of the erosion control blanket. So, you know, this is of concern because if you think about the extent of TxDOT projects, we accessed this back in 2021. The number of active roadway projects in Texas at this time were over 8,000 projects, you know, all across the state. Well, you know, if just a fraction of those have erosion control blankets on the landscape, it could be, you know, spell trouble for wildlife entanglement, right? So at that time, all these projects spanned over 37,000 miles across the state of Texas. So, and again, if just a fraction of those projects use erosion control blankets, that's a lot of netting on the landscape that could potentially entangle wildlife. So we wanted to, you know, we have some literature results, we have some field results. So we wanted to conduct an entanglement experiment and ask 2 questions to start. So what are the properties of erosion control blankets that affect the likelihood of snake entanglement? And what about the traits of snakes themselves? Because, you know, on the approved product list, we have all these different products that span all these different categories and traits and things like that. So are there certain blankets that are more prone to entangling snakes versus others? And so we did an experiment where this is a bird's eye view of our kind of experimental arena. This was a bare patch of soil where we introduced the snake to, and then on either side we had the erosion control blanket, and the snake was allowed to freely interact in this arena, interact with the erosion control blankets for 3 minutes or until they became entangled, whichever came first, and then the snake was removed if it did become entangled. And this just gives you an idea of that arena. So here's that bare patch of soil, and then the erosion control blanket installed on either side that the snake would interact with. And so we tested 3 types of erosion control blankets that were on the approved product list. The first one is this biomac. And so this biomac is polypropylene mesh netting that are fused at the corners here. And it's comprised of 2 layers. And in between those 2 layers, there's a coconut fiber and straw filler between them. The second one is this multi-mat. Is it any better? Or can you see my slides?
Yeah, Chris, no problem.
Okay. The second one was this multi-mat. And so this is, again, plastic polypropylene netting here, but the netting itself is not as flexible as it was on the biomac. It's a lot tougher and a lot stiffer. But these fused corners of the mesh, and it's comprised of 3 layers with no filler. And then finally, this core mat, which is a single layer. It's comprised of core fiber, which is woven. And so the corners of the mesh are fixed or fused. It's flexible, where it's just a woven mat. And so if we think about entanglement, it's kind of a stepwise process where a snake first needs to, basically poke its head through the mesh in it may or may not become entangled, right? The snake may be too small. It may realize something's weird or wonky and back out. Or, if it attempts to pass through, then it may eventually become entangled. So we wanted to see if there was any differences in the odds that a snake will attempt to pass through these different erosion control blankets. And so comparing the biomac to the core mat, 67% of snakes that we ran in our trials attempted to pass through, as compared to just under 30% for the core mat. And there was a significant difference in kind of these attempts made by snakes for the biomac. Comparing the biomac to the multi-mat, in terms of the odds that a snake will attempt to pass through, we found that significantly more snakes attempted to pass through the biomac as compared to the multi-mat. And then finally, comparing the core mat to the multi-mat, basically we found no difference in the odds that a snake will attempt to pass through this mesh. So we know there's differences in chances of or probability of a snake attempting to pass through. So what does that mean in terms of actually becoming entangled? So we have our 3 blankets here on the x-axis, and then this is just the number of snakes here on the y-axis. If a snake became entangled, that's in orange, and a snake that did not become entangled is in blue. So comparing the core mat first, of the snakes we ran, 38 basically passed through but did not become entangled, and no individuals became entangled in this treatment. Looking at the multi-mat here, okay, 49 snakes passed through or basically backed out and did not become entangled. Only 1 individual became entangled in the multi-mat here. And then comparing the biomac, it was basically a coin flip where 47 snakes passed through and did not become entangled, and 39 snakes that started to poke their head through eventually became entangled in that biomac. So again, it was more of a coin flip for this blanket here. So what about the traits of the snakes themselves? So we looked at 4 different traits, so snout vent length, tail length, head width, and circumference at the widest point of the body. And the only thing that was a significant predictor of entanglement was circumference. And basically, for every 1 millimeter increase in body circumference, the probability of a snake that becomes entangled increases by about 4%. So we see that there's differences in terms of the types of blankets that are more prone to entangling snakes. And so we wanted to see, okay, on the approved product list for TxDOT, what are the kind of the diversity or traits of the erosion control products themselves? And we kind of wanted to classify that and quantify that to see, okay, how are the products falling out in terms of what we know to entangle snakes, right? And so we use the 2018 approved product list, and just kind of breaking it down. At the time it's basically a kind of a PDF, and they're classified based on whether they can be used in terrestrial environments or aquatic environments, and then there's differences based on slope or soil type and things like that. So there's 2 broad classifications, either terrestrial or stream applications. And then again, further divided based on soil type and slope or shear stress in the streams themselves. So for the terrestrial application, there were 5 categories, an average of 32 approved products per category based on soil type and slope. And then for the stream application, there were 4 categories, an average of 59 products per category based on shear stress. And so, for the approved product list at the time, it's just a PDF, right, of all the different names of the products, right? So we don't necessarily know what the traits are in terms of the attributes of those approved products. So what we did is we went to the manufacturer to try and find basically kind of these fact sheets or info sheets on the product itself. And we wanted to look at, and kind of from these sheets, get information on 10 traits. So presence or absence of mesh netting, what's the mesh comprised of, the number of layers, the intersection type, whether it's fused or woven, how big the mesh is, the shape, how long it would be on the landscape in terms of time, or how it degrades, and also time to degradation. If there's any sort of filler matrix in between the layers, and then the degree of utilization is, how many categories is this product being used on? Can it be used across multiple soil types and slopes, or is it very specified? And so for the scope of this talk, I'm only going to present information on these two attributes, presence or absence of mesh netting and the mesh intersection type, but we can talk about the other attributes later if you're interested. And so really what the first thing we wanted to see is, okay, if you're a contractor and you're interested in maybe selecting a approved product based on certain attributes, can you find that information? Is it available? And so for complete information of all 10 of those traits that I mentioned, all 10 of those attributes, we found that for 69% of the approved products. So of the 141, we were able to find these information on these attributes for 69% of them. Just under 15%, we were able to find partial information for some of those attributes. And then another 15%, we found no information on whether it had mesh or whether it was woven or fused or anything. There was no information that we could find for that. And so as a result, the results I'm going to present are only on these 98 erosion control products for which we had complete information for. So in terms of the frequency of erosion control products with mesh, or the percentage, the majority, close to 90% of the erosion control products on the approved product list have mesh. And just under 20% have mesh absent. Okay. So the majority of them have mesh. And then, if you remember back to our experiment, we found that most snakes became, or all snakes became entangled on those mesh with fused and fixed corners. And the majority, over 50% of those erosion control products on the approved product list have this fused fixed corner mesh netting. Just under 10% had woven, about 20% they were stitched, and then other products, they were not applicable, like hydromulches or things like that. So the majority of products on the approved products list have mesh, and it's that fused kind of fixed corner mesh netting. So given that the majority of products on the approved products list have this type of mesh that is more prone to entangling snakes, we wanted to ask a question. Okay, what if you have an erosion control blanket that is, potentially prone to entangling snakes? And so we kind of started this next experiment because we noticed that the entanglements were not uniformly distributed across the blanket. Really, most of the entanglements occurred close to the edge of this blanket, where the two layers were kind of opening up, and the snake would, typically pass through and sandwich between those two layers and then pop its head out somewhere on this mesh, and that's where the entanglement would happen. So they typically didn't happen like, in the middle of the blanket itself. It was closer to the edge when it went through these two layers. So we just want to see, okay, if you can you modify or limit entanglements by basically burying that edge? And so we use that biomac that we used in that first experiment, where we had two treatments. One where the edge was exposed, okay, not buried, and the other one where we buried the edge, and this was according to the manufacturer instructions as well. So we basically, same scenario. We introduce a snake, let them explore and see if they became entangled or not. So here we have our two treatments. So we have our exposed edge and then our buried edge. The attempts but not entangled are in blue, and then the entanglements are in orange here. And this is just number of snakes on the y-axis here. So in the exposed edge of the 91 snakes, we ran 50 basically kind of passed through the mesh and were attempting to become entangled. When we buried that edge, that number dropped to less than 10 snakes. So big drop off in the attempts of passing through the mesh. Then looking at the entanglements, we found that just under 20 individuals became entangled on that exposed edge treatment. But when we on that buried edge treatment, actually no snakes became entangled, right? So it may be an effective technique to mitigate against snake entanglement as a result. So kind of synthesizing this and bringing it together. So, we think that, these erosion control blankets pose a risk to snakes, and it's really an additional agent of mortality that we think is underreported because these erosion control blankets, are installed and can go for miles and miles and miles. But once installed, no one's really checking or monitoring them for any sort of entangled wildlife. And if we look at the snakes that would probably be most vulnerable to entanglement, it's going to be those larger bodied species or adults or gravid female snakes that have that wider circumference as a result when they pass through the mesh. And we also think, we kind of hypothesize that active foragers are probably at greater risk to becoming entangled. So things like racers or coach whips, just because they're moving over larger distances and have a greater probability of or chance of interacting with these erosion control blankets. And the attributes or the traits of the blankets themselves result in differences in entanglement rates. So most entanglements occurred on kind of these thin diameter fixed intersection polypropylene mesh, which is another example seen here during our surveys. And at the time when we were doing the survey, the majority of the approved products on that approved product list possess characteristics associated with entanglement. But the good thing is what we were noticing is as we were doing the review across those different categories, like based on soil type and slope, there were meshless alternatives available in all of those categories, right? So things like hydromulch. So what to do. So you can either use these alternative products or these meshless alternatives, or potentially modify the installation methods. When we look at how these blankets were installed in the field at the conclusion of a construction project, none of the edges were buried. So you could potentially bury those edges, but we need to, there's a caveat there where basically the effect, we were conducting experiments, right? So the effectiveness of burying these edges under field conditions, under more natural conditions, is not known when they're exposed to weathering agents or soil, or I'm sorry, wind or rain or things like that, how long that edge may remain buried. And the other thing too is as it degrades, you see kind of new hot spots and edges appearing on the blanket that may pose a risk to an individual. We don't really know, right? So since these projects have been conducted, there have been some recent developments. So the approved product list at the time we were doing it was basically a PDF of all the approved products, right? It was just a name. There was no other additional information. Since then, TxDOT has created basically a website with this interactive approved product list where you can input your preferred product type, maybe the slope, the soil type, and it'll populate a list of approved products for that category. And then you can, go to the manufacturer's website to learn more or look at the product specifications. The other thing here is there's also a classification where you can select wildlife friendly approved products, right? And so if you look here down at the bottom or underneath, they define a wildlife friendly approved product as products designed or available with options that minimize entrapment risks per the manufacturer's specifications. So we don't know how that was evaluated. The manufacturers are saying if you install it as we dictate it, that it's wildlife friendly, but what goes into evaluating whether or not it's wildlife friendly, it's not known, but it's just what the manufacturer says. There are some unanswered questions. So, what are the vulnerabilities of other animals to entanglement, right? We've only worked with snakes. So things like small mammals, amphibians, or other reptile species as well. During our field surveys, this is a bronze frog we found entangled and dead in a erosion control blanket. We also found, large invertebrates like best beetles entangled as well and entrapped. What risk do these blankets pose to other wildlife is one question. And then, how does that risk change over time once these erosion control blankets are installed on the landscape? Our studies were mimicking recently installed erosion control blankets, fresh out of the box, right on the ground, that new ECB smell, fresh car or, new smell, all that stuff. But, as the vegetation grows up between the mesh, does vegetation growth reduce entanglement risk where the animal's not able to actually pass through that mesh? So we pose these two questions to TxDOT as kind of next steps, and I believe they funded some projects that are going to address these next questions that we pose as kind of the logical next step to ask. So with that, I'd like to thank folks from Stephen F. Austin State University, Southern Research Station, TPWD, and TxDOT for all their help in getting this project up and going and off the ground. And then funding was from the license plate grant program from TPWD, and also from TxDOT as well, and then McIntyre Stennis. And if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email, or right after this, I'm going down to the Texas chapter of the Walleye Society and say hi, and we can chat there. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
That was great, Chris. Thank you very much. Yeah, as a reminder to everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and we will read them out. So we have a couple of questions come in already, Chris. The first one is, did you find any small mammals entangled in the nets?
Well, we did not during our field surveys, no.
Okay.
So it was just the snakes, that bronze frog, metamorph, and then best beetles were the only tags that we found.
Very good. Did you analyze whether, with other attributes held constant, snakes with keeled scales become entangled more often than those with smooth scales?
No, we were, so for anyone that's worked with snakes, the big challenge is, and with this study in particular, basically sample size. So the design we did is pretty data hungry. So we basically had to aggregate all of our snakes that we had and only look at kind of those body size comparisons. Once you start divvying up among, kind of these species specific differences, it's statistically it's challenging to look at these species specific traits. So we didn't look at and the other thing too is we were mostly trapping in uplands, so we didn't have things like Neurodia or other water snakes that had keeled scales. So yeah, we didn't look at that specifically.
Very good. Do you think you could go back to the TxDOT wildlife friendly products page that you showed, the portal that TechStop created. There's some people that asking questions about the URL for that. Is there a, how do people find that? Would they just Google interactive TechStop?
Yeah, I think if you just Google text.interactive approved products list, it should pop up pretty easily.
Okay. Okay, great. And anybody, Chris's contact information is in there. If anybody can't find it and specifically wants to reach out to him, I don't think that would be a problem. Okay. Based on this study, will the approved products list be changed?
That I'm not sure. So that's out of my purview. So
Question for TechStop, right?
yeah.
Okay. In the field surveys, did you find most mortality near the edges like you found it in the controlled experiment?
No, I mean, if you actually look at, where was it? Well, I guess, this coach whip here was actually, I mean, I guess it's fairly close to the edge, but you can see it was kind of sticking its head underneath here, really in the middle of the blanket. So in that instance, we did not find that. But I can't remember on the rest for the other 10, if it was near the edges itself. That I can't remember, but I can ask around and look to check the notes and things.
Okay. Did you have any thought or any information on wildlife friendly netting? You mentioned that some of the other sources of entanglement were from netting, as opposed to erosion control. Do you have any data or speculation about stuff you'd recommend for that?
You're talking about like the garden netting and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, that other category you mentioned earlier on.
Yeah. Yeah, that, I mean, I'm not sure. We didn't really look into that in terms of surveying the landscape to see what's available as products. We were just interested in kind of categorizing it as, wildlife exclusion or not. So we didn't look at that in any detail.
Excellent. What about, there we go. How many snakes were used in the test plots, and were snakes used more than once? Did they
Yes.
learn from previous trials?
Yes. So basically, we had, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So we were still limited on the number of snakes, right? And so basically, we had, I think it was 118 snakes. But the issue is um, because we're limited on the number of snakes, we had to use them in all three trials or all three treatments. But what we did is we basically accounted for that, where we had this crossover design where they weren't randomly assigned, but we assigned them to a specific order. And we were able to account for any potential crossover effects in our design to see, okay, if they were entangled in this biomac first, does that mean they were less prone to poke their head through the multi-mat, right? And basically, we did control for that, and we found that there was no carryover effects between treatments for our snakes.
Excellent. Very good. Um, what? Another question here. What about straw wattles? I don't know what that word is. Used for erosion control that are wrapped in monofilament mesh.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, is there any efforts or research being done on organic versus inorganic materials like plastic material and mesh?
That I know TechStop funded that other project. I can't remember who got the grant, but I think there was a component of like plastic mesh netting on other wildlife, or comparing the almost like microplastics. I think that they were doing something with that, and whether or not it was ingested by other animals or things. So that project may have a plastic versus non-plastic component to it, but that I'm not sure.
Okay, very good. And I was just received an update on that question. I think they were talking about straw wattles, maybe those long tubes that are used to block drains and things like that. But with them being so stuffed, snakes probably aren't trying to get into them, are they?
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
Yeah. Okay. How long are these erosion control measures installed? Are they permanent?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, let's see, I can show kind of the decorate. So, oh, that's the only one I don't have. Dang it. Um, well, here's the degradation type. So, we can look at whether or not they're permanent or degradable. So, of those 98 approved products, 30% are non-degradable, right? And then the rest of them they're either photodegradable, biodegradable, oxidogradable, or multiple. And there's varying times in which they kind of persist on the landscape. So yeah, so about 70% are degradable and 30% are not degradable of those 98.
Great. I think that answers the question. There's a comment here from somebody that says, I remove silt fencing regularly from preserves, which are trapping turtles in a similar manner. So I wonder if that is an observation from Texas or from somewhere else. Somebody else then, yeah, is this product in trapping turtles? Obviously, you didn't have any information on that specifically, right?
No, but it makes sense if they're kind of maybe if that silt fencing is becoming frayed and things like that, and turtles are trying to pass through that they could get caught in it.
Okay, the questions are coming in fast now. These polypropylene panels are made out of materials that persist in the environment. Is there a time when they are no longer a hazard due to settling plant growth, or are these barriers posing a long-term hazard? I think you kind of addressed that already, right?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the next uh, project that's being conducted right now through TxDOT funding by
Great.
someone else. Yeah, not
Um, how large is the area the mesh blankets are laid on top of? Is it feasible to bury the edges of the mesh blankets if they're being applied to really large areas?
I mean, it depends, right? The areas that we were surveying were fairly small, right? Across those 9 or 10 sites is only 2,100 square meters. But, I was driving from Huntsville down to Houston one time and there was erosion control blankets on the landscape that went for miles, right? And so, yeah, you know, it may not be feasible in that instance, but then, is there another alternative that could potentially be used over that area as well, right? So I think you just got to weigh what's feasible given these project specifications. Because the other thing we didn't do that we wanted to is we want to see, okay, what would maybe be most cost effective, right? Is there a difference between these erosion control blankets with mesh versus maybe the woven ones or the hydro mulch or things like that? And because those Biomax, I think per roll, they were like 60 or maybe $80 a roll, and they're pretty light, easy to carry, and easy to get. The core mat, that woven one, that single layer one that we used, I think we ended up paying $500 for one roll because it was $250 for the roll and then $250 for shipping. It had to come from like Virginia or somewhere. So we wanted to kind of see, okay, what's most cost effective, but it gets real complicated real quick because it's how many, what's the area you're covering? If you buy a certain amount, you get kind of this volume discount, right? Where's it got to be shipped from? Where's your project? So it's really hard to kind of assess these cost effectiveness measures. So I think it's really, the challenges have really got to be done on a project by project basis, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, that's great, Chris. Thank you. There's a question here about the degradation. Question here. It's more about other things about textile. Oh, Clover's commented in here. Thank you for this, Clover. She says the APL list is a work in progress and that the follow-up studies testing the efficacy of wildlife-friendly products is ongoing, and the results of the effort are anticipated to result in changes to the list. So that's great. Thank you, Clover. Um, Okay, so one last question here so far, and we have a bit of time, so if there are other questions, please do throw them in there. This one is, it says, can you estimate the scope of erosion control, blanket mortality versus other human-caused snake deaths? I doubt you can estimate it, so whether you'd like to speculate about its importance is up to you, Chris.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's, there haven't been enough. It's not like doing kind of estimating like the road kills on snakes or something like that, where there's these large scale surveys that are conducted kind of that can be conducted in a standardized manner where we have lots of data and things like that. I think it's just starting off where potentially if there's some sort of follow up surveys to start to estimate it, I think that'd be kind of the good next step. But yeah, trying to estimate the actual impact is hard. Because the other thing too is don't forget, like, it depends when these blankets are installed on the landscape, right? If you install it in, I don't know, the middle of winter when snakes aren't moving, well, then they may not pose a risk to snakes, but maybe some other taxa, right? And so trying to understand kind of these spatial and temporal patterns, I think is kind of another follow up project for this.
Oh, that's great. And another comment here, really not a question, says, I'm a home gardener and I've had a lot of trouble with home-based mesh, as it was mentioned earlier. Even if checked daily, wildlife is dead many times before you can get to them. Snakes will crawl up a tree to get to birds who got caught eating peaches. So it sounds like somebody putting wildlife exclusion material over, agricultural products in their backyard has observed problems too. So yeah, kind of seems like an area ripe for additional research. Well, unless any more questions come in, Chris, that's the last of the questions and the comments. So I think we can go ahead and wrap up. I'm gonna steal the screen grab back from you again. So again, thank you very much for the presentation. It's great. A lot of really cool, very management focused and applied work. So